Nations speaks for us all. And yet when it speaks, it is not in the voice of moral relativism, nor is it in the voice of an equality of ideas, but rather it speaks for a coherent vision. It's a vision of rights, it's a vision of freedom, it's a vision of human dignity. With that in mind, we have a model for you today. We believe that the International Criminal Court should expand its ambit to cover gross offenses to the democratic process. We believe the same paradigm that will be used here will be used for what the ICC does for other human rights violations. The standard will be a gross violation of the necessary integrity of self-determination, free speech and free assembly, fair process, and accountability, the sort of things which are already preserved and protected within the UN Human Rights Charter. But now the International Criminal Court will also be able to deal with this. So in this speech, I'm going to bring you the reasons for this. First, I'm going to show you why the norms of democracy and democratic government are already embedded within the UN, and why if they're not, they ought to be. Then, we're going to show you why this will encourage democracy to spread worldwide in a meaningful way. And finally, we're going to talk to you about the concrete benefits which this will bring to the world community at large. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is what it means to be in the International Criminal Court, why we set up this body, and why it exists. We believe the International Criminal Court exists to prosecute gross violations against human rights. Furthermore, the privileges we enshrine as human rights are not necessarily universal. For example, there are places in which some people think genocide is a nice thing to do. There are places in which child laborers are really, really awesome. There are places in which people say religious toleration? What religious toleration? We don't believe this is necessarily good. That's why when the International Criminal Court acts, they don't act to say all values are equally good, but instead they say when these human rights have been violated, you've committed a crime, you'll be brought before the international community, not at this time. So, the question becomes, when do we actually choose this, and does democracy fit in? We believe that democracy clearly fits in within these core human rights for a number of reasons. And the first is the notion of individual autonomy and self-determination. We believe that the core purpose of every right we recognize as a human right is that people can live the lives they see fit without undue interference from others. This is why we have free religion, so people can pray to whatever God they want. This is why we believe that people shouldn't commit genocides, because you can't exercise rights, go to the ballots, or run a bake shop if you're dead. Additionally, we believe that democracy is the only way to meaningfully ensure this self-determination, because the principles of democracy are the only way by which we ensure everyone is equally represented. We ensure that you have a voice in your community, that you're the one who says the political conditions I live in will be thus. As a result, we ensure that your preferences are taken into account, and to the greatest degree possible, you determine your life. Sure.
Don't you undermine the credibility of the ICC when you put the democratic process on the same level as genocide, as rape, as torture?
No, I believe that genocide is an example of a gross violation of the norm that you shouldn't use violence. In the same way that the sort of gross violations of democracy we see here literally preclude people from having any voice or sovereignty at all. We're not talking about the Minnesota recount in the United States drawing international arbiters. We're talking about Zimbabwe. We're talking about places where sovereignty does not exist. But additionally, we think that democracy is essential to accessing all of your other rights. Because as time has shown again and again and again, without transparent, accountable, and proportional government, every other right you have is subject to all sorts of abuse. We think if you want to protect against a genocide, if you want to protect against tyranny, if you want to protect against any other abuse you find meaningful, democracy is instrumental and is the only way to ensure in the long term that it's possible to do so. We think that's incredibly important. What I want to close on is the notion of protecting meaningful sovereignty, because this is really important. One of the key norms in the international system is sovereignty, that each country has a right to self-determination. But let's take it a step back. Why do we care about this idea, right? The reason that we care about sovereignty is because it ensures, as well as we can, that the people in the country are getting what they want. We don't want China to dictate terms to Grenada, because we think the people of Grenada have a right to choose their own path. But in the sort of gross abuses we're talking about, in the sort of gross violations like Zimbabwe, which we believe will actually draw the ire of the court, there's no guarantee that this is actually a meaningful check at all. These people's sovereignty is being attacked, is being compromised, it's being compromised from the inside. At this point, we see no qualitative difference between this and the sort of other violations, such as invasion, that might occur. But the next question is, will this actually change norms? So if we agree that democracy is a good thing to do, if we believe that all other human rights depend on it, is this actually going to do anything? Because some people might argue, international courts don't change behavior, especially in America. Maybe you're international, maybe you have more faith in them, but I will combine your faith with our logic. The first thing that I want to talk about is the notion of changing domestic pressures. We think that when you set a norm in the international community, you give people something to rally around. You have opposition governments that can appeal to the people, appeal to any freedom they have, and say, look, this democracy is totally bogus. The international community says so. This is a good reason to support us. Something we've seen in effective resolutions around the world. Look to Eastern Europe's democratization, look to Korea's democratization. In every case, the support of the international community actually works here. We provide the symbolic gesture that allows us to happen, not at this time. But additionally, we think international norms affect even the most egregious offenders. So what are we going to talk about here? We're going to talk about how international norms actually reshape behavior. So take the No Genocide Convention. Now, a cynic might argue, look, genocide is still going on. But the difference is it no longer occurs openly. Even the most corrupt, evil leaders in the world feel like they have a need to constrain their behavior, to hide their behavior, and to lie. It becomes exponentially harder for even a Milosevic to execute this sort of behavior at the point where the world is watching and the world is not pleased. But finally, we believe that we're going to catch some people. Look to the case of Charles Taylor. We're going to have effective prosecutions at this time, and this is going to send a message that we are on the right path. What I want to close on, though, is the notion of why this will actually make the world a safer place for all. I'll take you.
So China, India, Japan all sit outside the ICC. Surely expanding its ambit will only make it harder to get support?
Well, that's a great question. I think the first reason that it makes it safer is that it brings in the most important player in the international community, the United States. Because the main criticism leveled against the International Criminal Court today is that it supports undemocratic norms, that it's led by criminal gangs that don't respect the true conception of freedom and that won't defend democratic rights. We think that this greatly increases the chance that the United States, a critical player in the international system, will actually join into the court and will actually be effective. But additionally, we view democratization as a safety issue, because when you have a gross violation, and when a clear majority of the people don't like what's going on, there's a really good chance they're going to take to the street and form a violent faction. Even Kenya, where there were relatively minor issues, had real problems when Raila Odinga said, oh, we lost the polls are busted, take to the streets. We believe that there's often spillover effects. When you lose an election, when you see that the process of legitimacy is closed to you, you will turn to the bullet, not to the ballot. On our side of the house, we ensure a safer world by having more stability. What I want to close on, though, is the notion that democracies are less likely to fight other democracies. When the people have to bear the cost of their foreign policy, when they have to actually send themselves to the battlefront, you get nations that are better behaved. That's why I challenge them to come up with a single war between democratic states in the modern era. If we move toward democracy, we move toward a peaceful world. If we move toward a peaceful world, we achieve our goals we propose.
Princeton. We were told, oh my God, democracy is supreme. If you violate democracy, we're going to investigate you. We're not sure what they mean by violations of democracy. If I run an Arabic country where the vast majority of my people are Muslim and believe that women are subject to men, and I don't allow women the right to vote, am I to be investigated? If I come to power legitimately, as Robert Mugabe did in 1979, and then become a dictator, is that also going to be investigated there? We're not sure what exactly they're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. We don't know how they intend to enforce this. We just don't know what's going on. I'm going to talk about three things here. I want to talk about the idea of international law, why international law is so nebulous, why it's very hard to say there's any international objective goods about the idea of political systems. I want to talk about the anti-Western sentiment and why this is a problem. And then I want to talk about the idea of this being perceived as neo-colonial meddling, why that's also bad. Ruth's going to talk about individual countries and how this undermines human rights law. But first, there's a few things that are rebuttal here. Because we heard some crazy stuff there. We heard that America is run by criminal gangs. We're not sure where that came from. We just don't understand that at all. We were told when you lose an election, you turn from the ballot to the bullet. We say that in democracies, there is always a loser in an election anyway. Therefore, this problem is not solved. There is still a losing party. Thank you very much, Principal. We were told people have the right to decide on their political process. We say people should also have the right to prioritise stability and basic human services above political ideals, ladies and gentlemen. We say that people should be able to say, under this dictatorship, we're generally better provided for than we would be under a fledgling democracy, and we're happy to stay this way. Furthermore, we say this isn't the idea of people citizens demonstrating their rights to choose politically. What this is, it isn't the West saying our way is our way or the highway. It's saying there's one objective good in this way, and you have to follow it. We don't like that. Even among Western countries, political systems are vastly different between the UK UK and Ireland and Australia and America, it's very difficult to decide on an objective political good. No, thank you. The idea of, you talk about sovereignty as well. We say that countries, the nature of countries in their development tends to be cyclical. Like we see this with China. China is slowly moving towards a more sort of free system through trading with the West and things like that. However, if you come in aggressively and say, no, you're objectively bad here, we want to step in and stop you and impose our form of government here, we think that creates resentment in these countries. It makes them less likely to want to cooperate with the West. I'm talking about this later when I talk about anti-Western sentiment. He told us oh, it's become harder to catch genocide, and this is a great thing. But see, the problem with the ICC at the moment is that the ICC doesn't really have that much power. Why? Because countries like the USA refuse to sign up to the ICC, ladies and gentlemen, and countries like the USA economically disincentivize other countries from joining, and so that they said that US citizens and things can't be extradited by the ICC and tried. We see when the ICC has no overriding international legitimacy, so we're not sure how effective it'll be. And he said the USA doesn't sign up because it's run by criminal gangs. The USA no, the USA doesn't sign up because it believes in its sovereignty and its ideals of rights. The idea of international law then. Because first Pop told us there is no international norm. We say, yeah, exactly, that's what we're talking about. We say generally the purpose of the ICC as it stands is about human rights. Why are human rights special and distinct from things like democracy? Because we say that morality is inherently subjective. It's generally when you go from country to country, there are different laws, there are different norms. In Amsterdam, prostitution is legal. In Ireland, abortion is illegal. And these things are generally socially accepted in various countries, ladies and gentlemen. However, what we say, though, is that protection of humanity is a fundamental ideal. Why? Because your right to life, your right to still be a human, is an enabling act, a right, a facilitating right that will enable you to go forth and utilize your utility and it allows you to actualize, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why we say it's different. Because all of the rights stem from your right to life, stem from your right not to be raped or tortured and things like that. We say once you infringe on these fundamental rights, that is different. Does democracy fit this? We say no. In many countries, democracy is a fluid process. And Ruth's going to talk about this. We say individuals within the nation should decide the identity of the nation. And if at the moment they think that it's better, that the ruling Communist Party provides them with more stability than any fledgling democracy, we say, okay, I'll take Dan. James, sorry.
Pray tell, how do these people articulate their voice that they do think that communism is better when they don't have any votes to do so?
Because we say that eventually, I'm talking about the idea of China. We say eventually these countries can move towards these different systems. We say there are ways for people to articulate their voices. If there are massive protests going on in China, the West will hear about it. There are other ways of getting involved, ladies and gentlemen. We say that the people should be the checks and balances of the system, not an outside third party. We don't like that. The idea of anti-West sentiment. We say anti-Western sentiment is one of the biggest problems of the modern era, ladies and gentlemen, because anti-Western sentiment comes about through things like the West getting involved in wars, through things like the West going back to the colonial era and still keeping a paternalistic relationship with these countries, that I'm going to talk about more shortly. So this leads to a massive problem. It leads, for example, to the rise of terrorism. We see this regularly through Israel and Palestine. The fact that when America offers support for Israel, terrorism grows, and terrorism is based on this feeling that the West subjugates and wouldn't allow people to actualize their sense of identity, their sense of ideological freedom. We say also, once you get this idea that the West is the one true way, the West controls this ideal of democracy, it increases the chances of propaganda from other anti-Western countries like Russia. If Russia can say, if the West starts investigating Russian elections, it generally works well for the Russian propaganda machine, who can say, look, the West are trying to get involved with this. They say we're not free to do these things ourselves. We say that when the West gets too much of an influence in these places, when the West tries to exert its power, there's always a backlash. We fear that backlash, ladies and gentlemen, because we fear things like terrorism. We fear things like the rise of massive anti-Western sentiment, because it goes against the ideals they try to propose, ladies and gentlemen. The idea of this universal world where people get along. We think that when ideologies are under attack, when political identities are under attack, ladies and gentlemen, that's when anti-Western sentiment grows, and we don't like that. Finally, the idea of neo-colonial meddling. What message do we send here? We're telling the countries here they can't be relied upon to run themselves. We're saying that these aren't objectively evil human rights violations, which we all think is bad, because generally people do think that killing each other is bad, for reasons discussed earlier. All we're saying is that you failed to live up to Western ideals, and therefore we're going to step in and sort you out. We're saying this paternalistic relationship means that these countries you're telling these countries they can't run themselves. There's always going to be this safety net here, and it means that these people are getting more and more checks. It's harder for them to break free from the West, and harder for them to become a stable, independent nation on their own, because the West is always there, is always looking over their shoulder, is always just saying, actually, you're doing things wrong, lads. You might want to sort it out. You think that's a bad idea, full-fledged nations who are trying to stand on their own feet. We don't like that idea, ladies and gentlemen. What have I talked about here? I talked about international law, why it's so nebulous, why a few things are, why human rights are different from democracy. I talked about the anti-Western sentiment, I talked about the idea of neo-colonial meddling. On those grounds, I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call across stage to continue the case to the government.
We hear an interesting line of opposition in this debate. These norms are good, these norms are great, many people might not agree with these norms, so these norms aren't good. This seems to be quite circular logic to us. What we want to bring to you on the side of opposition, and the new material I want to bring to you is, why is it these undemocratic nations we talk about, China, India, which is one of the most thriving or emerging democracies in South Asia, actually, but why is it that these nations will actually buy into the system we have in place? But before that, I want to deal with some of the claims they've made against our case. One is this notion of, will our model work? Is it too great? And I think that we've enunciated a pretty clear standard here. We say that we should extend the processes we have in place to deal with current ICC crimes, things like gross violations of human rights, gross violations of human dignity, and extend that process to gross violations of the democratic process. I think we did a clear job enunciating what those violations would be. Things such as a violation of a fair process of confiscation, a system where losers don't peacefully give up power when they lose, a system where there is no freedom of speech or association to meaningfully aggregate ideals, things that we all accept in democracy. What is the process then we have in place for the current violations of human rights? What we see is, in the current ICC, we have things like a non-biased panel that adjudicates these decisions, perhaps something like what we have in front of us, international in nature. What are the other things we see? Strong defendants' rights. What else? Formal procedures that are articulated beforehand, so there's predictability. At the end of the day, what does it mean then? What is a practical example of where this would happen? We see that in Zimbabwe, for example, we have a clear case of where the losing party is not willing to give up power, that they're not willing to play by the rules they themselves have articulated. We see this to be a fundamental violation of democratic norms and democratic processes. We think that in this situation, we could bring suit just as much as we could bring suit against Charles Taylor for violating norms we've articulated about human rights and human dignity. We think that if this is the case, then we would punish the parties responsible for subverting the democratic process and replay the game. We think that our model has been fundamentally clear and that their challenges don't really stand up. Beyond that, we hear some interesting clash on the notion of sovereignty. They say, you know, in a lot of places they have a lot of different views, and who are we to say what's right and what's good? We on side proposition we have two fundamental problems with this. One is the question of, is this meaningful sovereignty? Is the notion that, you know, we believe that we've democratically elected a government that believes in genocide, is that a meaningful expression of sovereignty, even if we were to believe that the democratic process is fair there? And we don't think that's the case. One reason is because, as Daniel articulated, that the democratic process, if it is subverted, doesn't mean that if the democratic process is subverted, we are not truly representing the aggregation of interests within that society. The reason why we believe self-determination matters, why we believe sovereignty matters, is this idea that when we come together, when we engage in the marketplace of ideas, when we bargain, when we collectively talk about things, we can make the best decisions for ourselves. If the democratic process is being, and that we should respect those decisions, being that we came to it together as a polity. If those democratic decisions or if these decisions don't come about in a democratic way, we have no reason to believe that this is a meaningful exercise of sovereignty. For that reason, but let's give them some credit. Let's say maybe they are right. Maybe in some situations you democratically elect to have, I think the example we get from opposition is a communist government. Would we then intervene? Would we subvert that? I think that this fundamentally is flawed because so long as the rules of the game are fine, then we're okay with people who choose to embrace communist or socialist ideals in that polity. What's an example of this? Chile has been led by a leftist communist and a Christian Democrat coalition for the last 30 years. But we see that people are willing to play by the games of the rules. People are willing to exchange power when they lose. It's fine if you believe that, you know, social equality is a paramount value over capitalism. We just need you to play by the rules. We just need to know that it's a meaningful exercise of sovereignty, something that they don't deal with. But beyond that, even if it is this meaningful exercise of sovereignty, has the United Nations, has the ICC shown that it's willing to disregard meaningful exercises of sovereignty? Yes, 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 it has. Where do we see this? We see this throughout many of the conventions that have been signed by all these polities that agree to the UN. Examples are CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. What's a great example we get from opposition? Well, in some places, under Sharia law, women might not have equal rights. So, you know, why do we respect, or should we respect them? We see that even if we think that people can democratically come to a decision about, you know, how to treat women, we still articulate norms that we would rather live by in a democratic polity, or in this globalized society. We talk about things like the Convention Against Torture. We see that some people think certain types of torture are more right or less right? But that doesn't mean we don't articulate norms about what we as a global quality believe to be acceptable. We see this on the Convention on Religious Equality. In some places, there is no conception of what religious equality is. It's fine to tax different religions at different rates, but that doesn't mean we haven't articulated what we believe the right goals to be, what we believe the right ends to be. And insofar as this is consistent with all the other principles articulated in the Charter, articulated in our notion of self-determination, then we ought to respect it and we ought to go by it. I'll take you.
So, would you try Hu Jintao's at Hague?
I believe that in this situation, I think this comes down to sort of the violations that take place already in the status quo. We think that despite the fact that some people choose to violate norms, they still, one, sign on to these norms, and two, we think we can use this as a strategic bargaining tool in these situations. We think that perhaps trying Hu Jintao might not make sense geopolitically or geostrategically, but that doesn't mean we don't enunciate these norms, right? That doesn't mean we don't enunciate the ideals we would hold up for people to agree to. Even though we don't try every sort of violation of CEDAW, that doesn't mean we don't enunciate how we believe women should be treated. Nearly every Middle Eastern nation has chosen to recuse themselves from enforcing certain clauses in CEDAW. And while we don't prosecute every single one of them, that is not a positive reason not to articulate these norms. But let's take these notions of undemocratic nations. No, thank you. Why is it that these undemocratic nations will actually buy in? Why is it that they will continue to join the ICC? We see that for the ICC to have any meaning, it must have real backing. One party that we talk about that will join is this notion of America, that America will come in when they see that their democratic processes are being promoted by the ICC. They try to strawman this argument by sort of taking up one quote from Dan and saying, well, the U.S. believes it's a criminal gang, it's not a criminal gang, so then therefore it must be a false argument. What we say is the main reservation the U.S. has given for not joining the ICC is this notion that it doesn't adhere by democratic processes, is this ideal that it doesn't adhere by democratic norms. We believe we take away that excuse and force their hand, say that this is in line with principles. But what about these more undemocratic nations? Nations like China, they say. Will these join? We think that, if anything, we provide a rallying point for people to come around, and we can leverage. We can make this a meaningful lever, and we can leverage other things, like economic agreements or trade sanctions or things like that, that force all these other nations to come in. So I want to refer back to sort of the convention that we have on religious equality or the rights of women. While many of these nations seem to not believe in it, we sort of force them into accepting these as norms. We think that that's a direction, that's a step in the right direction. We make this a norm that they at least agree to a name, if not in principle, and we think that without that, there is no moving in the right direction. So where does this norm come down to? We've shown you that this is clearly a good norm. This is a norm that we've embodied in all our other founding documents, and it's a norm that should be promoted. Their only criticism of this is that sometimes we can't enforce it. Is that a meaningful reason not to articulate these norms? We think no. We think that if this is a meaningful norm, we should articulate it because it provides a way to move in the right direction. We think that ultimately we've brought you the mechanisms through which we can come to that right direction. We can use things like trade sanctions and economic agreements, and ultimately we believe we're the only side that promotes true meaningful exercise of sovereignty.
The other big assertion that they had here was
is not in the ICC is because it doesn't infringe on their sovereignty enough. Like, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the US has come up, and I know, boys, I know you're from Princeton, right? But the US have come out and said they are not willing to have their soldiers tried in the ICC. The US have come out and said they are not willing to have their foreign policy subject to the ICC. Why on earth, when you're now putting internal democratic processes subject to the ICC, would the US join? Assertion. Well, thank you. Right, then we have a fundamental problem with this. Like this idea of the ICC and the UN and enforcement, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think this is hugely harmful to the UN. We think that when they talk about all the conventions the UN have signed and their unwillingness to act on those conventions, we think that is the problem with the UN. We think putting another thing in front of them, ladies and gentlemen, when they have no enforcement mechanism, no agreement, and they've shown themselves that they'll only prosecute certain people, and they won't prosecute certain people if they're too powerful, ladies and gentlemen. We say that's inconsistency in the law. That undermines the law entirely, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, right? So why are we using all our political capital to get something which we can't enforce, ladies and gentlemen, and we've no willingness to enforce? When they talk about this will condemn Mugabe and this will get democratic change in Zimbabwe, we'd like to know how. Who's going to change in Zimbabwe? Who's going to take that action, ladies and gentlemen? Why is this not just another meaningless statement? And so my first point, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have sovereignty, right? From a purely pragmatic states and international relations point of view, we have sovereignty because we understand that in international ground, we can't all be responsible for everyone in each individual state. We understand that individual states act for regions and act for those countries. And we understand that we must be able to reach agreements with them, ladies and gentlemen. If we suddenly say that we have the grounds to assess what sovereignty is and what a nation should be, on no other grounds that it's what we think is a good norm, rather than it's a huge harm to an individual, we say that's hugely harmful in terms of how those states interact with us and how states interact with each other on an international environment. Go.
Sure. We have conventions against torture. China still tortures, and because they're so powerful, we don't enforce it 100% of the times. Based on that logic, would you now abolish the torture convention as well?
This is very important, right? And this is moving on to my second point. I'll come back to my first point. We have conventions against torture, right? And China violate them, and we have Liberia and the Human Rights Council, and it fundamentally undermines them. We have the ICC, and we even trust them to do something so important, ladies and gentlemen. You told them you are responsible for prosecuting crimes against humanity. You are responsible for prosecuting crimes that fundamentally violate who we are as people. You are responsible for prosecuting crimes that are so bad we think they deserve international condemnation, and we think that we should act on that international condemnation. When you suddenly reduce what your standard for that international condemnation is, when you suddenly expand what the ICC is doing to include a whole host of other crimes, ladies and gentlemen, we say that you undermine the ability of the ICC to act. In one, when we say less people will be willing to join the ICC. We see this when the US is using economic sanctions against people. We say two, when the ICC is no longer dealing with crime so fundamental and so terrible, every other crime is just kind of bundled in and it diminishes that. And three, in terms of how these views are perceived by people. You say in the Western world, you say it's just another ruling the ICC has made that isn't being followed. In non-Western countries, in democratic countries where they aren't huge genocides, this can be brushed off again as another anti-Western sentiment, as another thing the West is trying to, another example of the West trying to impose ideals. We say when we're trying to reach out to those people in those countries where these huge atrocities are happening, we shouldn't be saying these are our ideals. We should be saying these are our fundamentally what we think is good for you if we are to be pragmatic about this and if we are to actually get real change and real action on the ground. We think conflating the two is hugely damaging to the ICC. That's my second point. No, thank you. Then this idea, just bring back to my first point, the idea that we have an absolute obligation to impose democracy, we think is also quite dangerous. We think this idea that the UN is a democracy imposing machine, ladies and gentlemen, undermines what we think the UN is about. We think the UN is about a talking shop. We think it's about sovereign nations coming together and discussing things, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's about a power balance between the members of the UN Security Council, who include Russia and China, and people like that who are unwilling to recognise the ICC. We think we should keep the primary focus of the UN on this sort of talking, ladies and gentlemen, and this kind of bargaining power within people. And also, just in terms of what I was saying about, like, when an ICC ruling is made, right, if we're to get any climate change, we have to look at some sort of enforcement, right? If the ICC is saying this is genocide, we say there's much more willingness on countries to intervene in that country. If the ICC is saying this is like unfair democratically, and the two are conflated, we say there's less willingness to actually intervene. And just in terms of why this is just so unnecessary, in terms of those countries that are undemocratic, we say they aren't going to sign up, it will have no effect, ladies and gentlemen. We say even if they were signed up, and you say, oh, this is bad, we say we say Mugabe's bad all the time, it doesn't have any real effect. We say alternatives even if we wanted to take action against countries, alternatives that we currently have like sanctions are far more effective, right? And James just said, we need to give these people a voice. Well, that's not what we're doing here. We're saying our opinion is your voice. And in terms of democratic countries, well, they're not going to sign up, and also they can handle their internal affairs themselves. I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon Dan to continue the case on behalf of the closing government.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've had some contentions out of these guys. First, they bitched and whinged about the model for a while. Then they told us that it's very important because people collectively can decide that it's no longer important to collectively express their will and we should validate each other. That wasn't acceptable. And then they told us other things are important. So I'm going to deal with our last point first because it was stupid. Talk about how this undermines the role of the UN. The UN should continue as a talking shop. How? We're talking about the ICC. We're not talking about the United Nations. I believe that the UN can go on talking regardless of what we do here. She then talked about how it's a waste of political capital. And this comes back to something that her partner said, that this undermines the ICC's role in the important things in the world, important things like genocide, and important things like human rights abuses, important things like rapes and crimes against women. And I'm sorry, but they've not proven to me, and it's a controversial point, they've not proven to me why raping someone, raping a large body of people, killing everyone in a village, is less damaging to basic human rights norms than stealing an election, ladies and gentlemen. Why would this be? Why is this specifically true? In some circumstances, for example, during the Iranian Revolution and in anti-democratic actions which the Iranian government has taken, things like disqualifying female candidates, things like disqualifying moderate candidates, are precisely aimed and consequentially lead to the crimes that they are talking about. Do you believe if women had democratic rights in Muslim countries, equity violation, that women would still be stoned to death for being raped, ladies and gentlemen? I don't think you do. What these guys told you today when they were talking about wars, when they were talking about rights, is the reason democracy is important, is the reason democracy is a perfect good in this sense, is that democracy is the only way large groups of people can combine together to negotiate what rights they see are important. That is why democracy should always be protected. That's why international legal norms should do so. So then there's some other stupid stuff they have, but this is more or less a constructive point. So democracy is good, we'll carry on with this, right? Subverting democracy is subverting an expression of sovereign will, right? Is it? Okay, when you subvert democracy, are you saying that the people are right and I want to help them? No, you're not. What you're saying is, when you steal an election, you're specifically saying that the collective will of the people is wrong, that you fear the consequences of those people. Countries are not sovereign. Mount Kilimanjaro is not sovereign in itself. The body of people that Tanzania represents are sovereign, and through the democracy, they can be protected. Now, why is this specifically important right now? This idea of where democracy is under threat, and I'll give you examples in this. Because when there isn't a specific framework for what constitutes the minimum standards of democracy under international law, it allows leaders to use the salami tactics to take liberty away one slice at a time. When do we see this? We see this in long-established democracies, like in, for example, Venezuela. They've got the oldest tradition of democracy in South America. When Chavez can get in and say, there are different types of democracy and none of them are individually perfect, when he can say that Bolivarian socialism is the best type of democracy, is an appropriate type of democracy for this region, and that democracy means no term limits and I get to be king. What we say on this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, is that when, and I'll come on to why the ICC is brilliant at doing this, when a non-nation state, an unbiased panel, sets what the minimum standards of democracy are, it gives all actors understanding of what it is. It gives Chavez a red line not to cross. It gives opposition parties in Venezuela a line to get behind and to explain to their people why he's not violating a Western ideal, why he's violating a true and universal ideal. And it gives regional bodies such as the African Union and South American organizations of states a red line to point at Chavez and say, no, Bolivarian socialism isn't some neat idea. It's a subversion of the democratic ideal that will one day ruin your country. So for the rest of my speech, after this guy, I'm just going to talk about the ICC.
So perhaps the clear lines of their own constitution might be more acceptable to these people?
Okay, hold on. Sorry, no, don't laugh, don't applause that. It was a constitutional amendment, that was the point. He was taking his constitution, tearing it up, and saying, I am King Chavez of the Socialist Republic. Okay, so right, why is the ICC boss, as opposed to the United Nations, which is less than boss? It is, having just recently been recognised, the system of appointments of judges, the maximum authority of the IPCC, is not done by national nominations in the same way as UN human rights tribunals are. It's done by judicial appointments from existing judges. Therefore, you do not have any political influence on the way that these appointments are made or the decisions that they make. Why is this better than the UN? For example, Liberia, China, and Russia do not sit do sit on the UN Human Rights Committee, whereas qualified judges capable of making independent decisions sit on the ICC. Why is this important? Because when we try and stop these Islamic tactics in the past, our attempts to defend democracy are always tainted by national associations. When we try to tell Robert Mugabe that his system of democracy is not perfect, that rigging elections is bad, what does he say? And I won't do an impersonation. He says, why does the UK get to criticise me when you sell seats in the House of Lords? He says, why does the US get to criticise me when you steal elections via hanging chads in Florida? By separating national government from democratic norms that are able to be enforced, we give credibility to them. Why is this specifically important in one country that's near to my heart? When the opposition in that country is judicial, we look at the successful actions of the judiciary in Pakistan, defending democratic norms there, defending their right to a free judiciary and a right to free electoral commission. They have two sources of credibility. Under your model and the status quo, they have lots of Western states which are opposed by their people for various reasons. Under this system, they can put to their profession's representation in the international context, their profession that's bringing Charles Taylor to justice, and say, look, these unbiased guys support us, you should support us, and we should as well. Right, then we've had a lot of chat about like why would or wouldn't sign up. Okay, the three examples I gave, like Japan, China, I can't remember the other one, are all democracies. Why would they oppose this democratic principle any more than any other principle, right? All the existing members of the ICC are very democratic nations which would be reasonably bound by this. Why is this important? Because one of the things the ICC does usually is coalesce diplomatic power around these things. But why is it specifically important? Why is it different from sanctions? Because the IPCC prosecutes individuals. It is not Zimbabwe that the IPCC is after. It is Robert Mugabe himself. Whereas we've seen that sanctions don't work against these countries when they subvert the diplomatic process. Maybe 50 years in the prison in The Hague might do something about it. This last point here is their idea of who are you going to prosecute? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be all these other rubbish countries? No, what the IPCC is absolutely brilliant at is setting a principle that human rights are important in all scenarios, but prosecuting first based on pragmatism. Prosecuting the worst offenders first, like Charles Taylor, prosecuting the countries we have diplomatic influence with, like countries in Africa, countries in South America. We have a pragmatic, unbiased, powerful court defending a clear principle that no one could object to it, because if they did, they could object to it democratically by voting against it. Therefore, I beg to propose.
Thank you very much. I now call upon Victor to continue his case on behalf of the closing argument.
anti-Semitic for the opening government. In my rebuttal, I will firstly comprehensively explain to you why this is a troubling principle to be pushing forward, and why we think that on a principled level, all of the benefits they've claimed are wrong. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the ICC, first and foremost, must be concerned with outcomes if their principal justification is that this will bring benefits to democracy and around the world. Then it's damn well the obligation to show that the ICC will actually bring those benefits. And our extension will show you how this sets back the cause of democracy in many of these countries and drives them away from potentially positive engagement that can bring them into the democratic fold and the benefits that come from that if it's done voluntarily. So I want to have 3 points of rebuttal firstly. I want to have a look at whether principally this is the biggest priority for the world as far as norms are concerned. Secondly, I want to look at the way in which this will be implemented, whether they'll prosecute or whether there truly are benefits to just having norms in an abstract environment. How's that work for the UN Declaration of Human Rights? And finally, let's talk about this idea, their extension, that this will be seen as the only truly apolitical body on human rights, and why that's just ludicrous. Ladies and gentlemen, is this norm a priority for us? Well, sure, I think that democratic rights are pretty important, but I think that my right to food, shelter, to not be raped, ladies and gentlemen, and not to have me, my family, everyone else killed, is far, far, far more important. For that speaker to get up here and say that losing an election is akin to genocide doesn't seem to have any conception of what humanity is about. I mean, like, I don't want to call him a robot, but that's really what it seems like. Right? And we think that people in these positions don't care about their political rights until they have food, water, shelter, and the basic elements of the state being provided to them. And that's why we think it's incredibly important that the ICC starts at the very beginning and ensures that the priority norm is one of basic, fundamental human rights. Not nice rights, like your ability to choose to do whatever you want. They don't prosecute America for not allowing gay marriage, right? It's about fundamentals, and genocide is a fundamental because you can't exercise your right at all when you're being killed, basically. And that's why this is the fundamental part to start. We think in terms of this being better as well. We think that perhaps they were trying to say that, well, democratic nations protect all rights better, and therefore this is good. We say democratic nations don't equal protections for human rights. We say the Bhutanese only voted in their elections because the king forced them to. We think Singaporeans are fairly happy with their autocratic government that sues its opposition into bankruptcy and can't run in elections, because they have the basic needs that they're much more concerned. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a ridiculous notion. Secondly, let's talk about how it works or whether there are benefits of norms. What we heard, ladies and gentlemen, is that they will sometimes prosecute. Yay, they'll selectively prosecute in some very few cases. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that they'll have any benefit prosecuting when we don't think any countries, or at least the majority of countries that hold veto seats on the United Nations Security Council, like China, aren't interested in backing this up. And there's something I'll talk more about, just looking at what the ICC is actually capable of doing. And then we heard, ladies and gentlemen, that we won't sometimes prosecute these people. We think that's incredibly problematic, and that's why it's apolitical, as I'll talk about a little bit further. But is there a benefit of norms? Well, we heard it gives people a clear line. Well, the point, ladies and gentlemen, is that if they were willing to tear up their own constitution, we don't think they'd have any qualms about tearing up a foreign document that is held by the Council of Democracies. So, ladies and gentlemen, bullshit. But we also point out that amendment failed and they kept the constitution. Would they join in, ladies and gentlemen? Well, in the case where they do join in, we think that's one of the worst outcomes, because just as countries like Libya have held the chair of the United Nations Council on Human Rights, we think this gives countries a veneer to say, yes, we've done enough. And then finally, is it apolitical? Bullshit. Their opening already conceded that practical decisions will be made about who to prosecute. That is inherently political, because you decide, as the nation's doing the prosecuting, who you don't want to piss off. That's politics. We think furthermore that of course this is seen as Western, when the majority of people on the ICC are Western democracies. We just don't buy it.
Sir, not a single implementation argument you've given us is unique to this particular convention. If you believe all these arguments, why have the court at all?
Well, one, because that's not the debate. And secondly, because we think the problems of implementation are not insurmountable when there is global consensus on the most terrifying actions. Ladies and gentlemen, about what I'm talking about. 3 points about practical, wonderful extension over here. Firstly, we think the ability for the ICC to do anything depends on international consensus. Secondly, we think this is counterproductive to engagement in countries with problems. And thirdly, we think this undermines grassroots changes to democracy in many of these countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the ability for the ICC to do anything relies on international support, particularly from the United Nations Security Council. Why? Because the ICC is established by an act of the UN, and also because it has no army, it has no police force, and it requires the international community to enforce it. So we think the International Criminal Court obviously can't be effective in this case when they're trying to get countries to get people out. But we think more importantly, it needs to be able to build consensus. And the ability for the ICC to build any consensus requires it not to be pursuing things that are in principle objectable to veto members of the United Nations Security Council, like China. Because the one thing that they are most afraid of is the West trying to force democracy down their throats. The second part of our extension, we think it's counterproductive to engagement in countries with democratic problems. We think the ICC is very careful about even when to prosecute crimes against humanity, because they think in many cases it can be counterproductive. We'd say that's probably why they haven't prosecuted Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. We think in many cases engagement is actually key to protecting people's rights and to ushering countries on paths of democratic reforms and respecting people's rights. We think England's engagement with Libya and Gaddafi helped Libya to move away from state-supported terrorism and its worst oppressions of human rights violations in its process. Ladies and gentlemen, when you try Gaddafi before the International Criminal Court for not allowing democracy, why the hell would he engage with the West? Because the one thing that they want to see is that they're not the ones copying the blame under this system. We think that when you target them as individuals, they do everything they can to entrench their power. That's my final point. That we think democracy is not in and of itself something that can just be made to magically happen in countries. It's something that takes time to develop, and dictators will have an incredible incentive to stamp down on moves towards democracy when they are aided by Western organisations under their model. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that firstly, the basic rights necessary for democracy have to come first. That's why the ICC should be focused and specialised. But secondly, we think the response when prosecutions are being levelled is to kick out Western aid agencies. That's exactly what happened in Sudan when Bashir was tried for crimes. We think that cuts out the NGOs that help promote the development of democratic institutions in China and throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, on a principle level, they've got their priorities wrong, but practically they don't help and they undermine progress towards democracy in nations that need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now ask for James to close the case for
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we were looking at two things in this debate and why we think ultimately side propositions work. We're first looking at why we do think democracy is important. Why we do think it's important you have a choice about how your government treats you, and how we don't think you can sell that down the river, how we don't think you can sell future generations down the river. Now when women don't have votes, we don't think we can exactly say that they agreed to be in that situation. And then we're looking at why the ICC is a particularly good body to do this, why I think it's a particularly good body when it, one, has biases to it, and secondly, when it has a personal attack on people. When it does not condemn a nation, but it condemns an individual for his or her stunting and harm to the people within that nation. What do we get from the last speaker, first of all? One, he told us it was important to build consensus. What we needed was consensus. He told us why we were necessary, for example, this happened for China, for Russia, etc. What did he then tell us? This can be counterproductive. And what did he say? He said, look, the ICC doesn't always prosecute people at the moment. He said, yes, Madam Speaker, that's the exact point. It doesn't always prosecute people. At some point, we ultimately have to sacrifice our principles for pragmatism. We say that occurs when you do it, for example, when you don't drag in China to human rights abuses, which we currently don't prosecute anyway. We say we probably won't do that for democratic processes either, but we say we do get several other problems. Particularly when we start targeting democracies that start regressing away from democracy and towards totalitarianism. He then told us, look, the problem with this is that people in charge of these countries don't want to cop the blame themselves. We think that's exactly right. We think that's why it's a good disincentive to start going and messing about with democratic institutions in your country. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, why is democracy important? Because they said, look, it's not particularly important. It's just one of those things we think are quite nice. It's not in the same league as, say, human rights, etc. Well, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we say that democracy guarantees that you safeguard all other rights. We think this is vital. We just look, no thank you. We look at the fact that democracy tends not to abuse people's rights, because if you start abusing people's rights, you will get voted out. When you are democratic, there's no such barrier to you abusing rights. So when they tell us, look, what we really don't like is when things like genocide, etc. happen. We say, why not stop it at source? But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, what can often happen is you don't get what necessarily genocides and the like, but you torture individual people. You curb the freedom of speech of individual people. That's a problem that occurs when you have a blanket policy of non-democracy that affects everybody, and then the pernicious harms of not being democratic fall particularly in physical torture, etc., in beatings, suppression, and running people over with tanks. They can fall on individuals, where you might not necessarily be able to get a proper prosecution in the ICC for that simple individual act, but where ultimately we say that it's clear that the lack of democracy did lead to it. We then say that you can't vote against, we think that you simply can't choose to not have a choice. We think ultimately what they've told us is, look, it's incredibly imperious, culturally imperious, to say that democracy is a force for good. No, thank you. What about people who don't want democracy? Well, we'd say they can choose not to have democracy if they want, at 5-year intervals or whatever. The problem is, ultimately, if you want a particular type of regime, say, in which it's a largely Republican versus Democratic regime, fair enough. What we ultimately say is, one, you can't set it off for future generations. But two, how do you even know that those people want it when they never had a chance to express their desire for it? No, thank you. Well, they gave us 2 examples in which was apparently the refutation and the analysis against this. Singapore and Bhutan. We think, how on earth do you know those people don't want to vote? How on earth do you know when the opposition and dissenting voices are suppressed within Singapore, for example, the people of Singapore don't want it? Ultimately, how do you know that when particularly oppressed minorities, for example, women, who actually very curiously are the minority within the world,
So, when you target an individual, you make them do everything they can to ensure that they never lose power, because as long as they're within their sovereign borders, the ICC can't get them.
Okay. I'm going to move on to individuals later, and trust me, I will actually discuss that. Okay. What they then said was, look, these are abuses of sovereignty. We say we don't recognise nations that aren't democratic as particularly sovereign. We may say it in the UN, fair enough. That's part of the realpolitik how it goes. But in terms of sort of nebulous thing of why we must protect their sovereignty, we don't think it's particularly important. We then think that there's actually more likely that the US becomes involved in the ICC, particularly one of its main aims throughout the world is spreading democracy and the policing of democracy. We heard from Princeton that actually it's an incredibly important part of the US's opposition to the ICC, because I think that that's something that's important to promote in the international world. So why is the ICC good? We say for 2 reasons. One, it has a very clear voice, and 2, it makes a personal attack. No, thank you. So the ICC is better than the UN for several reasons. Because essentially, the UN inevitably is comprised of countries. In terms of the decision-making process that occurs in the UN, it occurs at the country level. What happens in the ICC? In the ICC, we have individual judges deciding. They are not political. They aren't influenced by politics. Because, as Dan told you, the decision-making process that gets them there isn't a political one, so they don't have to cover their backs in that sense. Furthermore, they've shown by the very fact that they are people interested in the judiciary, that they are people who have gone through a process of vetting within their own country, and then in the international community, there are people who are particularly prone to following the rule of law and not being influenced by the simple politics on the ground. No, thank you. We then say that ultimately we have a clear voice within the ICC, one which we think people can trust because it isn't influenced by all the necessary political all the political influences that exist when the UN makes a judgment. We think they tell us that Libya sits on the Human Rights Council. We think that's great. We think ultimately if you want to start condemning people, it makes it rather difficult to do so. We think the ICC provides a clear avenue in which you can. We think it also provides a clear avenue in which you provide a clear voice of condemnation. in which we also think that means that people don't feel the need to resort to violent action, is it in Kenya? Because what we ultimately say, Madam Speaker, is this is about democracies which are ultimately regressing. We look at Kenya, we look at Venezuela, where people are trying to disassemble the things that make those places democratic, trying to remove the amount of association that can happen, trying to remove freedom of speech and freedom of the press. What we do is we stop and disincentivize people from ever going upon that route. Because we say to them, you will have a personal problem if you do that. It's not simply there will be sanctions that affect your entire country, it's that you yourself will be put in prison if you try and do it. We think there's a clear disincentive to those people. We think there's a clear tarnish upon their political legacy and their historical legacy, something we see those people as seeing as important. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, democracy is important. It is vital for the way that people live. And the ICC is the best way to stop police. We have another layer, the police state. We beg to follow.
Thank you very much. I now call upon Ravi to close the case for the opposition.
I'm quite disappointed that closing government just didn't want to engage with all the material that Victor brought out in his extension. The fact that all those kind of benefits you want to talk about, developing democracy, they are all harmed when you implement this proposal, because it stops the kind of engagement that is necessary both at a governmental level but also on the ground, like the basic stuff like aid workers going in and spreading those kinds of things. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that it makes dictators kick out the NGOs, and we think that's bad. I'm going to look at two broad things. Firstly, human rights and the role of the ICC, and secondly, ladies and gentlemen, democracy. So firstly, in terms of human rights and the role of the ICC, and consistently we've been saying this fundamentally undermines the key role. Because what we heard from the government member was the idea, I think this is almost a direct quote, rape, torture, genocide, how can that not be worse than stealing an election, ladies and gentlemen? Now, I'm pretty sure you all got this and why this is wrong, but let's make it clear. Under one scenario, you are dead. You have serious physical and mental harms, ladies and gentlemen. You can't exercise any basic rights. Under the other one, ladies and gentlemen, you're still alive, you still are intact. We quite frankly think the first is important. Quite frankly, what good is a vote, ladies and gentlemen, when you have no food? What we'd say that these kind of considerations have to be taken into account into the ICC, ladies and gentlemen. It is necessarily a pragmatic kind of thing. And the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, we're happy to accept that it may not be perfect at the moment. So the point is, you make it worse. All that kind of lost credibility that you have is even worse when you add an extra layer of stuff that you have that you're just not going to prosecute in every level. That just multiplies and magnifies any of the problems that might exist right now. So if there is a problem now and we think, yeah, it's not perfect, you actually make it worse. And what we heard, closing on, was the idea that actually it's better because it's not going to be seen as political. We have a couple of responses to that. Firstly, we think it is going to be seen as political when it is run through the UN. And hot tip, guys, it is formed through the Rome Statute, which is something that the UN set up, ladies and gentlemen, so it is going to be through the UN. Or we'd say, who are the kind of people who are going to be the judges on the panel? It's probably going to be people from democracies, ladies and gentlemen, probably from the West. So we say it does entrench this kind of mentality that it is from an elite club of the West. But even more than that, ladies and gentlemen, you yourself accepted it's going to have some sort of pragmatism. And Victor brought this up, it wasn't responded to. The fact that in the real world, you don't prosecute everything. You don't prosecute every violation. That's a political consideration, ladies and gentlemen. When you pick and choose the countries where you prosecute, that is fundamentally a political consideration. Any country that gets picked on will see it as clearly a political consideration and will have an easy way out of all of this, ladies and gentlemen. I think it fundamentally is a serious problem.
Sir, the only meaningful difference you've given us between this and other human rights violations is the existence of a supposed global consensus. But around the world, the vast majority of nations, even China and Russia, nominally, formally support these principles. It is a global consensus.
We say that's just not true. We don't think this is a global consensus. But second, we'd say, and the other kind of major justification we've given you, is that the kinds of things that the UN Human Rights Convention protects now are so much worse, ladies and gentlemen. Genocide and rape and torture are far worse. We think, quite frankly, there is a substantive difference. So the idea that this is going to somehow stop these kind of violations if you have democracy. Like, if you get a democracy in place, this means that you get all those other rights. The problem with this analysis is it assumes a perfect democracy, ladies and gentlemen, and it assumes that all the benefits from your model are going to flow perfectly. Because it's not true, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't prosecute every case. You can't claim you're going to start getting benefits for democracy, you're going to start getting all these human rights in a variety of different countries, and you're not prosecuting in every kind of system, ladies and gentlemen. And what we'd say, quite frankly, sovereignty is important to respect. It's a construct. It comes back to what we're talking about in our engagement. Sovereignty is important. When governments feel threatened, when governments feel their sovereignty isn't being respected, then they don't want to engage and respect other countries, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think you want to respect sovereignty. Secondly, let's talk about democracy. What we heard was the idea, actually, before I do it, go.
When there is no harm to you with assembling the parts of democracy that are necessary, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc., what is to stop you from taking away salami slices of liberty?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, look, we think if countries, governments are going to do this kind of salami slice sort of stuff, whether you have a declaration of democratic principles or not isn't going to matter. Like, countries have constitutions in place which they can take away through salami slices. But more importantly, we think that if you have this kind of process in place, you can actually stop it. Your example of Venezuela, the most recent referendum that Chavez put up, the most recent changes, was rejected by the people, ladies and gentlemen. So we just don't think you're exactly holes. Anyway, talking about this kind of red line not to cross, ladies and gentlemen, what we would say is that firstly, the UN and the ICC is already going to see as a kind of Western thing. Secondly, we'd say, as Victor pointed out, you have the kind, excuse me, you have their own constitution. But thirdly, and this is quite important, when you already have this kind of thing being violated, when you already have it not being supported in every case, it loses its meaning, ladies and gentlemen. It's not absolute. So all those kind of benefits that you want to talk about having this reserve, just don't exist. But more importantly, it hurts an important level of engagement, ladies and gentlemen. It hurts the kind of engagement that you want at a governmental level. Why? Well, simply because dictators, when they feel threatened, they push back. They push out aid workers. They push back against the government. Like, look at the Myanmarese, the junta, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't allow aid workers into their country after a hurricane, which had serious implications for the law of the world because they were afraid of the influence. When you have this kind of thing, when you brand someone as a violator of human rights or democratic rights, you want to take them to the ICC. What chance do you think you have of engaging with them and getting them to change? When dictators are under pressure, they crack down even more, ladies and gentlemen. Like, think about it. If you're a dictator, why are you going to keep aid workers in place who can gather evidence for the trial that's coming up for you in the ICC? You're going to push these people out. Why is that bad? It's bad, firstly, because those kind of groups are important for building institutions and grassroots democracy, the kind of stuff that Victor talked about. But secondly, they're important, ladies and gentlemen, for basic humanitarian aid. Human rights, ladies and gentlemen, the basic support that you need to live. We think that, like, which is the core concern of the ICC, that sort of stuff is undermined when you push these kind of groups out. We think, quite frankly, the importance of engagement, as Victor pointed out, like, this kind of democracy doesn't happen automatically. It needs to come from the ground up. You are hurting the engagement with the groups who are going to develop that kind of democratic principle that you want to talk about so much. At the end of this debate, what we've told you is that if you want to promote democracy, don't brand the dictators as people who are, international criminals. That only hurts engagement. They crack down even more, and they push out the aid workers. You undermine the ICC, you undermine human rights, and you hurt democracy. We beg to oppose.